Okay, well, welcome everyone. My clock says the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm Denise Ellsworth. I'm with the Ohio State University Department of Entomology and Department of Extension, and I want to welcome you to today's Seed Sharing and Seed Law webinar. Nice to have everyone here. We have already about 600 people in the room. We had a really nice, robust registration for this program, so I'm glad you could make it live. We'll also be recording this session and posting that link so that you can review the session if you'd like or share it with others. So I wanted to offer just a quick commercial. Some of you have been to my webinars in the past. I have a new webinar series that starts this Friday. It's the Bumblebee Short Course running for 6 Fridays. So really get us into the heat of the spring here in Ohio, but it is intended for a nationwide audience. We have some wonderful presenters talking about bumblebee biology, identification, both east and west of the Mississippi. We'll be talking about some of the threats to bumblebees, conservation issues, things that we can do as community scientists to help bumblebees. So that link is up on your screen. It's that go.osu.edu/bumble if you'd like to register. And we have other webinars that are on our B-Lab website, so I put that link up there for you as well, go.osu.edu/OSU-B-Lab. And so really those other webinars are what brings us here this morning. We just finished up our Attending Nature webinar series. Maybe you attended that, or maybe you watched some of the links. And when we had Lisa Olson from Wild Ones come in talking about a lot of the community projects out there to help pollinators and increase biodiversity, this issue of seed saving, what we can and can't do, came up. And I, thanks to a colleague, was able to make contact with David Francis, who's in our OSU Department of Horticulture and Crop Sciences. He does a lot of teaching around this issue, around seed saving, plant breeding, and genetics, disease resistance. And even though it's a busy time of year, especially with spring coming, David said, I'd love to come in and do a program. Let's find a date to do this and help share what people can do to collect seeds in a way that's healthy for the plants, that helps with breeding, and that also has in mind some of that seed law. David is a professor with OSU, also does a lot of teaching and research. You see him there in the field with tomatoes, working a lot with genetics. David, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate your willingness to be here and teach us about seed sharing and seed law.
Thank you, Denise. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
And get ready to go. So Denise has introduced me, so I don't really need to say any more except to really thank her for the organization and support behind this. I've done a lot of webinars in the past where I was trying to run everything. And so it's a real pleasure to have a pro at my back. So I want to thank her for that.
Thanks,
I also want to thank you all for attending and allowing me to talk a little bit about something I'm passionate about, which is seed sharing and seed saving. A lot of what I'm going to be presenting today was developed as part of a Seed to Sustainability workshop series. That series was funded by an OSU Linkage and Leverage grant, and had support from Community Food Initiatives and Ridge and Hollow Seed Alliance down in Athens, Ohio. And the subjects that we covered in that workshop series were basic botany for seed savers and sharers, germplasm resources, seed cleaning and storage, seed-borne diseases of plants, seed saving techniques, and then seed law. And the subjects that are in red on this slide are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. And originally, when we were working with Community Food Initiatives and Ridge and Hollow Seed Alliance, we were focused on crop species and vegetables. And so some of what you're going to get, it really has that perspective. But when I talk about germplasm resources, I'm going to focus on natives and hopefully provide you a little bit of information that's useful to you. And then I'm going to talk about seed law in general. Again, originally the focus was going to be Ohio, but as this registration sort of blew up and we brought people in from all over, I've tried to generalize it a little bit more so it's not just Ohio focused. So with that as an introduction, again, my perspective on this comes from the crop perspective on seed saving and sharing. And the goals of seed saving and sharing when we're talking about cultivated plants are to preserve the distinct, unique, and stable characteristics of a variety. To preserve genetic variation, which can have a definition such as allelic diversity. There's also an aspect of protecting ownership and intellectual property that comes into play, and I'll touch on that briefly today. So the perspective may be different when we're talking about crop species, but there's considerable overlap with native plant preservation. And I will try to draw those overlaps today. So as we talk about basic botany, the point that I really want to get across is knowing your plant is really important in terms of guiding techniques for seed saving. And so many plants produce both male and female reproductive parts on each flower. And so this slide is showing you just a diagram of a perfect flower. So the female parts, the stigma and the style and the ovaries, this is where the pollen lands, and the pollen is coming from the anthers. Okay, so when we have a perfect flower, it has both male and female plants. Often, but not always, that's associated with inbreeding. So the plant self-pollinates, which from a crop perspective is great because it's easy to preserve the characteristics of a variety. Now, there are perfect flowers that cannot self-pollinate. And again, this gets into the nitty-gritty and sort of a species-specific issue, whether there's genic incompatibility or not. And again, this is where knowing the species that you're working with comes into play. So the flower structure is going to guide you to an extent. Now, I want to contrast that perfect flower with another crop here. So some plants produce separate male and female flowers, and those plants tend to reproduce with other individuals. In other words, they outcross. Okay, and so again, if you look at the tassel of a corn plant, that's the male part. That's where the pollen is shed. And down here where the ear is, that's a grouping of female ovaries that each produces one egg or a kernel when it's fertilized. Okay, and so corn is a classic example of a plant with separate male and female flowers. And the whole point in talking about crops right now is just to emphasize that the reproductive structure of the flowers is going to determine how one saves seed. Okay, and so if you are trying to preserve distinct and unique characteristics, you may need to bag flowers in order to ensure that they self-pollinate rather than outcross. Cages can be used both to exclude pollinators, but in some crops, the cages are actually used to add pollinators, flies or bees, so that this group of plants in each cage will pollinate each other but not cross-contaminate. And so this kind of bagging, caging, pollinating by hand, or pollinating with insects is going to be specific to the genus and species that you're trying to save from. Okay, so the message here is know your plant. Okay, I want to talk now about preserving genetic variation or preserving biological diversity. And specifically, I want to talk about where we can go for plant germplasm. And I think many people are familiar with the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I'll try not to let my cynicism come out, but the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is a one-way vault. Things go in, but they don't come out. And I want to contrast a vault with an accessible and living collection. And so what I'm going to do is give you an example of a crop-specific or a species-specific germplasm center. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Plant Germplasm System. And really what I'm doing here is I'm cheerleading for what I consider to be a national treasure. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the resources that are freely available through germplasm centers. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is near and dear to my heart. It's the Tomato Genetics Resource Center, which is hosted at UC Davis. And this is a collection of wild and domestic tomato species that was founded by Charlie Rick starting in the 1940s. Okay, and so this is my familiarity with this collection allows me to talk a little bit about what these germplasm centers do. And so in this slide, I'm emphasizing seed amplification. And so you see in a greenhouse here a crew of students that work with the TGRC that are collecting pollen and then using that to hand pollinate different collections of wild species. And so there's an example here of a green fruited wild species of tomato. This germplasm center knows the wild species really well. They know which ones they have to graft in order to reproduce in a greenhouse. So one of the things that these germplasm centers do is reproduce seed in a way that preserves, in this case, the features of the population from the original collection. Okay, so they then clean the seed, store it, and distribute it. Okay, so another function of germplasm centers is not just to preserve, but also to make available seed. And we'll comment on this function again in just a little bit. Okay, now most germplasm repositories have information available. And so what I'm pointing here with the arrows is you can do database queries. There's a whole section on seed germination, growing and reproducing wild species, etc. And so I've amplified that section and then looked at seed germination. And really what I'm pointing out, I don't expect you to be able to read this. What I'm really just pointing out is that the seed germination recommendations are there, and they talk about the things that you can do to get, especially wild tomato species seed to germinate, okay? So there is a wealth of information if you know where to look for, okay? So this is an example of a database query for an accession. It's looking at a wild tomato relative, so Solanum pimpinellifolium, which many people would know as the current tomato. There's in the accession details, there's notes on the original sample size. So 3 plants were actually collected from for this accession. And so in the collection notes, we learned that it's more than one individual, so we should consider it a population. And we need to consider that when we're thinking about maintaining the diversity of the accession. Okay. And so, excuse me, on the website, there is a section where there are recommendations for flowering and reproducing wild tomato species. And so what I want to point out, I've kind of highlighted here that seed are, in this case for these Galapagos Island tomatoes, there's a recommended population size, in other words, how many seed you want to grow, that those are going to be reproduced through selfing, and that should maintain the diversity in the collection. In contrast, if you go to some of the more distantly related wild species, the recommendation is that you grow 50 or more plants and that you do mass sib mating. In other words, you collect pollen and then repollinate to make sure that the allelic diversity is preserved. There's also a section over here that talks about how best to germinate those seeds. So in the case of tomato seed, in most cases, a bleach treatment works, but that treatment needs to be from 1 hour to 30 minutes, okay? And then, again, I'm going to kind of reinforce what I was trying to say in the basic botany section. If we take the time to examine the flowers, in a cultivated tomato, you notice that the stigma or the female portion is completely surrounded by the anther cone. Okay, and so this flower is just going to naturally self-pollinate. In nature, wind or bees can help shed pollen, but it's almost always going to self-pollinate. In contrast, if we look at a wild tomato, and so this is actually a wild Pimpinella folium here, so going back to that current tomato, you can see that the stigma is exerted. Okay, and so it's a perfect flower, but the stigma is exerted, which is going to permit outcrossing. So in saving seed from a plant like this, we're either going to want to do it where we can exclude pollinators, or we're going to want to hand pollinate in order to maintain this as a true accession or population. Okay, so now I want to switch gears and I want to talk about the National Plant Germplasm System. So this is a USDA ARS germplasm network. And what the map is showing here are the location of various germplasm repositories spread throughout the country. And I'll point out for those of us from Ohio, in Columbus, there's an ornamental plant germplasm system that's part of this network. So these are ex situ collections that perform the function that the TGRC does in Davis. That is, they maintain, grow out, and distribute the species that they have. So at the National Plant Germplasm System, you can search for germplasm and see where different collections are distributed. And in this slide, I'm also giving a shout out to Dr. Vivian Bernau, who is the USDA ARS scientist at the National Plant Germplasm System in Ames, Iowa. And I'm giving a shout out to Vivian for two reasons. One is that she's a graduate of the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science here at OSU, go Bucks, but also because she was the one that turned me on to the reports section where germination recommendations can be found. Okay, so the URL for the National Plant Germplasm System is here. And I believe that Denise has taken all of the URLs presented today and pasted those at the beginning of the chat box, so you can recover them from there. So this is the home page, and here you can decide what you want to search. And there's a lot of information on crop germplasm committees, who's on them, what they do. In searching, we can search for accessions. We can search based on taxonomy, characteristics, origin, name, or plant variety protection status, including expired PVPs. Okay, so I would encourage you to explore this to find out what's there. What I specifically want to point out is that there are, I want to provide a tutorial for finding germination recommendations from the experts in the National Plant Germplasm System. So if you navigate to Grin Global and click search, there's a bar where you can choose reports. And again, this URL will be in the chat box so you can get there. Okay. And then you can select the type of report, and you can see that there's accessions available from a site, crop traits and codes, descriptors lists, but there's this germination methods here. And so if we select that, we come to another page where we can either type in a specific germination method, a species name, a genus name, and I chose to put in coneflower genera here, so Echinacea, because I knew that this report would bring something up. And so then we get to click View Report, and this is just a subsection of the report, but what you see is a whole list that can be downloaded as an Excel file, and there's a description of the chilling requirements, the light-dark regime, and even ethaphon treatment. So ethaphon is an ethylene analog, and so for some recalcitrant species, treating with ethaphon may help the germination. Okay. Now, Vivian points out to me that the quality of information available for this report varies greatly by taxa, but it turns out for Echinacea, there's a wealth of information there on essentially germination methods that are used by the experts at the National Plant Germplasm System. So I would invite you to explore the reports section for the genus and species that you're interested in. Now, of course, there are other sources for germination information, and you all probably have your favorites. One of my favorites is actually from Prairie Moon, a company based in Minnesota. And they have a downloadable spreadsheet that has germination codes. So it sort of talks about what you need to do based on a code. And then if you go to another sheet, there's a whole list of genus, species, common names in that code. And so you can kind of scroll through, and in the middle here, I'm highlighting the milkweeds. Okay, and so these are coded as C30. If we go back here, C requires cold, moist stratification. And then the number here is going to relate to a temperature. Okay, so again, just pointing out that there's a wealth of information out there that provides details on how to germinate seeds. So starting with the National Plant Germplasm Center and then moving to commercial sources of information. Okay, take a pause here, and there's something I want to reinforce. So I've been cheerleading for seed banks and the National Plant Germplasm specifically. What I do want to point out is that they are generally underfunded. They should not be considered a substitute for commercial seed. What they do is send limited quantities of seed for research purposes. And so what I found, especially with the National Plant Germplasm Center tomato collection, is they literally get thousands of requests from homeowners, and they are unable to fulfill those requests. So what you may need to do is work through organizations to access, so professional organizations, extension, or others. And if you're a group that are interested in accessing certain seed, you may need to commit to providing information back to the National Plant Germplasm System. And this is perhaps something we can have discussion or question answers on. But what I'm trying to reinforce here is that the National Plant Germplasm System isn't a source of seed for your garden. But if you work with an organization that's willing to do some evaluation and some grow outs, you can contact the National Plant Germplasm System curators for the species that you're interested in and enter into a dialogue with them. Okay, and then finally, this germplasm network is a great source of information on germination techniques, storage, population sizes, etc. Okay, so I've now covered the botany basics and the germplasm resource, and I'm going to move into the yawner, the seed law. And what I'm hoping to cover is the sort of why and what, give you an example of seed sharing law, talk about changes to seed saving or seed law. And I know that there's significant interest in this, and I have a perspective on it that I'll share. I do want to talk a little bit about intellectual property and plant variety protection. And I'm not going to talk at all about seed germination testing or seed storage, really. So let's talk about why. Why do we have seed laws? So this is a screenshot from something that was tweeted out by one of the international centers. And all it's really doing is emphasizing that profitable agriculture requires good seed. And getting better seed to farmers is important. This is something in the United States that we take for granted, but in many countries, access to high quality seed that is actually of the variety intended is an issue. Okay, so we have seed law to protect farmers, to make sure that they are buying what they think they are, to ensure that the seeds are viable and will grow that intended variety, to ensure that seeds are not mixed with weed seeds. And this is a real, this point here is an issue for the native plant and the conservation plant community. And then finally, there's the intellectual property aspect of protecting developer rights. Okay, so I've got a paragraph here, and I'll go ahead and read it, but I want to point out that the source here is from the American Seed Trade Association, so that URL is available. So Federal Seed Act came into play in 1939, and it requires accurate labeling and purity standards for seeds that are in commerce. It prohibits the importation and movement of adulterated or misbranded seeds. It works in conjunction with the Plant Protection Act of 2000 to authorize that the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, regulates the importation of field crop, pasture, forage, or vegetable seed that may contain weed seeds. USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service is responsible for enforcement of labeling and purity standard provisions. In most cases, the Agricultural Marketing Service enables states to regulate this. So to distill it all down, what seed law is really about is accurate labeling, purity standards, and then to regulate importation to prevent weed and pathogen spread. Okay, I think most of us would agree that these are good things. So let's talk a little bit about who writes the laws. Okay, so there's an Association of American Seed Control Officials, or AOSCO. It consists of regulators from the United States and Canada. They were organized in 1949. They update something called the Recommended Uniform State Seed Law, or RUSSEL, which they develop and maintain as a model for states and federal programs. Okay, so I need to say that RUSSEL itself is not a law. It's simply, you could look at it as a recommended best practices. Okay, so if we focus on Ohio, so the Ohio Revised Code, Chapter 907, talks about agricultural seed. Ohio law is modeled on RUSSEL with the goal to protect consumers and farmers, to ensure seeds are viable, will grow the intended plant, and are not mixed with weed seed or unwanted plants. What I will say is that current Ohio law does not reflect current recommended uniform state seed law. Okay, and this is going to be an important point for people that are interested in changing Ohio seed law. A place to start is to look at current recommended uniform state seed laws. Okay, and I'll point out why. Okay, so what this slide is trying to do is synthesize kind of everything that I've been talking about here. Okay, so there are professional organizations that make recommendations to federal and state authorities. Okay, and that main recommendation is RUSSEL. Okay, there are enforcement organizations. So APHIS is charged with federal enforcement. In Ohio, the Ohio Department of Agriculture is charged with state enforcement. There's an organization called Ohio Seed Improvement Association that's charged with testing and certification. Okay, so professional organizations develop protocols, they certify labs that do testing, and the idea is to protect consumers. All right, so it's a mix of public and private organizations working together. All right. So American Seed Trade Association, I point out that they have on their website best management practices for environmental and conservation seed. And so these practices are not law, it's simply a recommendation. And so for the seed savers and sharers that are interested in native species, I would say that looking at both RUSSEL and ASTA recommendations for best practices are a good place to start if you want to convince state governments to change laws to better reflect what you're trying to do. Okay, and again, just going down, so there's an association of official seed analysts and a society of commercial seed technologists. They have rules for testing seed. There's seed vigor testing handbooks, purity handbooks. Tetrazolium testing may be important for seeds that are recalcitrant to germination. So if you're scaling up an operation and you actually need to demonstrate that seed are viable, the tetrazolium testing is a method to do that. Okay, so the main point here is that there are numerous resources and publications available. And I was going to say freely available, but I believe that the Association of Official Seed Analysts and the Society of Commercial Seed Technologists sells their handbooks, but I think the price is reasonable. Okay, so seed sharing and seed law. This is something that's been on people's minds for close to 10 years now because of something that happened in Pennsylvania. So what's become known as the Simpson library case, where the state interpreted exchange of seed under the 2004 Seed Act, which regulates the sale and distribution of seeds. And that act says that it's unlawful to sell or offer for sale seeds that have not been tested for the percentage of germination or tested to verify that they do not contain prohibited noxious weeds or are not properly labeled, okay, or have been advertised in a misleading manner, okay. In the Simpson library case, sales of seeds was interpreted to include exchanges where no money changes hands. And so this was described as an aggressive education and enforcement action. And I'm providing you two popular articles that touch on this Simpson seed sharing case. But that incident in Pennsylvania triggered a response. So why would states regulate seed sharing as selling? I think that's a question many people would have. So one answer to that question is to protect intellectual property rights of variety originators. And so when we're talking about seed libraries where vegetable seed are distributed, how do we know that we're not doing the equivalent of copying an album and making it available, or making a Xerox of somebody's book and making it available? If we put it in those terms, you could see how seed sharing through a library could be interpreted as a form of piracy. We're not really protecting the creators. We're simply distributing with no compensation. And then the second reason is concern regarding noxious weed species such as Palmer amaranth. And so there have been incidents where in conservation and ornamental pollinator seed, Palmer amaranth seed has contaminated that. Okay, and so the whole purpose of inspections is to make sure that noxious weeds aren't contaminating what we're distributing for conservation and pollinator habitat. And I think we can all agree that that's an important step. We can also probably agree that the volume distributed matters here. It's different if I'm distributing, a small seed packet with 25 seed rather than pounds and pounds that are going to go to reestablish a prairie. Okay, so there is a state-by-state approach to changing seed laws. The Sustainable Economies Law Center made some recommendations following the Simpson Library case. So the first recommendation was to redefine sell to reflect the plain meaning, that is, an exchange of money. They also recommended some exemptions for non-commercial seed sharing, exemptions to labeling requirements, to seed labelers' permits and fees, to record maintenance requirements, and they also recommended exemptions to micro enterprises, which they defined as sales below $10,000. Okay, so these recommendations have not been put into place in many state laws, But they have been largely incorporated into a 2016 revision of Russell. So an amendment defines the term agreed upon by the Sustainable Economies Law Center Working Group for non-commercial seed saving. Okay, so non-commercial seed sharing means that no monetary consideration or compensation may be transferred in return for receiving seeds. Additionally, anyone distributing seeds under the rules of this definition may not expect or create the expectation that seeds must be returned in exchange for receiving seeds. If distributions of seeds is found to be in anticipation or connected to money paid for work or services rendered by the same person distributing seeds, such distribution shall not be considered non-commercial within these rules. Okay, so there's a definition of non-commercial seed sharing that's incorporated into the latest revision of Russell. And again, a link to that version is here. Even though it says 2017, this links to the 2016 revision. I've verified that URL. So for those of you that are interested, there's a resource there. Okay. The 2016 Russell Amendment also defines labeling requirements for seed sharing. And I don't want to go into these step by step, but there are specific labeling requirements. And again, if you belong to an organization that's actively involved in seed sharing, my recommendation is that you look at these and implement them to the best of your ability. Okay. The other thing that the 2016 Russell Amendment does is it adds some regulatory exemptions, but also defines signage and exclusion of PVP protected material for seed libraries. Okay, and so it's basically the 2016 Russell Amendment is telling you how you should sign, in this case, a library, a seed sharing library. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about plant variety protection and what it means. But the point is that if a variety is PVP protected, it should never be accepted or distributed without permission from the certificate holder. Okay, so because I mentioned that, it's a good time to talk a little bit about intellectual property. So plant variety protection was established in 1970 and amended in 1994. The amendment in 1994 added tuber crops. It's a voluntary program that provides rights to breeders, developers, and owners of plant varieties. It gives breeders up to 20 to 25 years of exclusive control over uniform and stably sexually reproduced or tuber propagated plant varieties. So PVP is one form of protection. There are others that have really come into play with crop varieties in recent years. Recent years really maybe means 10 to 20. But there's three types of intellectual property protection in the US. I've mentioned plant variety protection, and I'm going to come back to this. There are plant patents, and then there are utility patents. And there's a difference in these, in what can be done. And so I'm gonna really focus on plant variety protection. So for me, plant variety protection is actually the almost the perfect open source protection. Farmers can save seed for personal use from varieties that are PVP protected. Okay, so it does not exclude a grower from saving her seed and reusing it. It does exclude a grower from saving seed and then turning around and selling it. Okay, there are also no restrictions on breeding. In other words, you can cross a PVP protected variety with other varieties and select among the progeny. Okay. On the other hand, plant patents and utility patents restrict both seed saving and breeding. Okay. So depending on the level of protection, there is the possibility of continuing to use material for breeding purposes and for saving seed for personal use. Okay. let's talk a little bit about labeling requirements. And so what this slide is showing is like a typical analysis tag that would go with a bag of seed. And then there's some definitions here. So kind, the crop is corn, how many seeds per pound, where it's from, when it was tested, variety name. Okay, so brand is optional. It typically identifies a company. Seed variety is required on labels, and so this is making sure that somebody is buying what they think they are. However, in labeling laws, one can use variety not stated. And so again, if one is thinking about how do I label natives, then variety not stated is probably appropriate, because if it hasn't been given a variety name, and that can be abbreviated as VNS. And again, you can look up the labeling requirements for your own state. I'm borrowing from Ohio here, but my guess is because all states to a certain extent are using various versions of Russell, that there's going to be a lot of similarities going on here. Okay. And just briefly, if you're interested in germination tests, there's a number of resources available, ranging from Seed Savers Exchange to professional guidelines. So the EASA rules for testing, et cetera. And these resources I'm providing you, with the idea that at some point your seed saving activities may be scaled to the point where you really do fall under state law and need to be aware of it. Okay, so among native plant propagators, there's concerns about letter and interpretation of seed law, including the definition of cell, labeling requirements, and germination test requirements. And I'm pulling out an example from Ohio law here, where agricultural seed certification and labeling definitions, sell or sold, includes transferring of ownership, offering or exposing for sale, exchanging, distributing, giving away, or transporting in this state. So this section right here is no longer consistent with the Russell recommendations. And so if somebody was interested in a push to update Ohio law, a good place to start would be to try to work towards making Ohio law consistent with current Russell recommendations. And so again, I'm just going to suggest that this recommended uniform state seed law is a good model to start from. Now, changing your state law is going to require effort by stakeholders, that's you. It's going to require a comparison of current law with what Russell recommendations are. It's going to require coordination with the State Department of Agriculture. You want them on your side in this endeavor. And it's going to require a champion or two in the legislature, right? So you're going to have to form a group with a common goal. There are good reasons to update state laws, including fostering entrepreneurship and cultivating new seed businesses. And I think that this is something that, because there are good models out there, it's really a matter of forming the team and the energy to do it. I'm a little cynical about certain state legislatures, whether this is a priority, whether it could ever become a priority. But given the number of people that are attending this webinar, my guess is that for states where your seed laws really don't match the Russell Amendment anymore, you can make a good case for moving forward. I wonder if I should also say that be careful what you ask for, you just might get it. So that really concludes what I wanted to talk about. So I want to thank you for your time. And again, I want to thank Denise for providing a backbone for this and support. She's been monitoring the chat box. I haven't, or the Q&A box. I haven't been able to do that while I've been talking, but I think I've left enough time that we can take some questions. You're muted, Denise.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for that excellent overview. And there are lots of questions actually in the Q&A box. Folks, I have turned the chat box back on. And so if you have some just comments or links you want to share, you can do that there. Give me just a second and I'm going to post again. I know that some of you actually couldn't get that list of URLs if you joined a few minutes late. I learned that today about Zoom, that you can only see the chat once you've joined. So let me repost these links. And I know that there is an error, but I wasn't able to change that just yet. Okay, so here are all the links that David talked about. I will also send these with your follow-up email. So you'll have all these in an email message. You don't have to worry about them there in the chat box, but they are there. The second link under professional guidelines, I guess, is not working, and I'll correct that link and send it with the email because I can't do it right this second. Okay, and what I usually like to do, David, is kind of group the questions, and but there have just been a lot of questions coming in, and your information I was trying to listen to, and so I wasn't able to group as much as I usually do. But there are a couple questions about, well, the one that got the most upvotes, it was on, should we be worried about nativars, which are cultivars of native plants, of course, that are masquerading as natives, and I'm presuming that Julie means in terms of saving seeds and how that kind of plays into the whole scenario.
Okay, so good question, and the answer is going to be maybe a typical academic answer. It depends. So if anybody is concerned about like intellectual property, you can search patent databases and PVP databases online. And so if there's a nativar that's actually owned by somebody, then that would show up in a search. And so you would know. Okay. And again, I would say that I would be highly skeptical that a nativar would have a utility patent or a plant patent. It might have a PVP, but a PVP does not prevent you from saving seed for your own purposes. So if you want to save seed to replant it for the next year, it's not a problem. Okay. It is a problem if you're saving seed to sell it. And so if you're saving seed to sell or exchange, just do the search. And start with the PVP database. Now, there's another point to that question of should we be concerned about nativars? And really, what that is if you're trying to establish a native landscape, but you're not using something that's truly a native, you may not actually be providing the biological diversity that you had in mind. So instead of producing or reproducing a prairie, you're reproducing a Disneyland version of that prairie. Okay, so really two aspects to that question, I think.
Okay, great. There were a few questions about repackaging seeds. So Megan asked, can you buy seeds from a bulk seed company and then sell them in smaller packages in your own brand? Someone else asked, it's a different question, but sort of similar. Can you buy a package of seed for your own use and then give away the rest that you don't use at a seed exchange?
Yeah. Okay. So again, good questions. So there's again, two aspects to that. So seed companies buy in bulk and redistribute all the time. But they are doing this under state seed law. So in other words, the seed that they're buying in bulk has been germination tested and inspected. And those inspections are passed on to the seed company, so they can document. They have the documentation they need, right? And I'm sure there are many of you who have bought seed before from a company and found out that it didn't germinate. If that happens, if you go back to the company, they're going to replace that seed, right? I mean, they're not permitted to sell you seed that doesn't germinate. Okay, so I think that's one part of it, but the other part is can you buy and then share at a seed exchange? And I think that's a gray area. And it's really going to depend on how aggressive the state you live in is willing to be about regulating these kinds of events. And again, my recommendation, if you're hosting a seed sharing event, my recommendation would be that you look at your state seed law and you look at the Russell 2016 amendments, and you at least comply with those recommendations about signage. Okay. And so, there's all kinds of gray areas. So, if I'm taking a package of heirloom tomato seeds that's not protected and I'm sharing it, I'm not violating any intellectual property. If I live in a state where sharing is considered commercial exchange, I may be violating the letter of the law. On the other hand, if I'm distributing seed that's actually PVP protected, I may be actually violating intellectual property laws. Okay. So, and this is, to me, this comes down to a question of ethics. Would you make a recording of an album, take it to an album exchange and trade that for another album? And are you in fact taking money out of the hands of the creators, the musicians that put that together? Right. So
I think that's a really helpful analogy. I appreciate your sharing it that way. We don't usually think of, all the time and the work and the expertise that goes into plants as kind of that intellectual property. So it helps to provide some perspective. Kathy says there are companies on eBay, et cetera, that sell what they claim are hybrid vegetable seeds. Are they really hybrid varieties? Is this a scam? I know you can't speak to all that's out there, but just your kind of perspective on what may be happening online.
Yeah, I can't speak to that at all. I really can't. There are, the seed industry is layered and complex. There are companies that you've never heard of that bulk up a lot of seed and then distribute it to other seed companies, right? So, if a company wants to fill out its catalog, they may go to one of these other companies. Is it possible that some of that gets resold on eBay? I suppose it is. I'm a little sad about that because I really like looking at seed catalogs. It seems like half the fun goes away, but
right. It kind of gets us through the winter, right? All those nice, glossy, promising seed catalogs.
Yeah, exactly.
Faith wonders what the laws are about mailing seeds overseas.
Okay, so that's an important question because it depends on the country you're sending it to. And so, even for something as simple as tomato seed, I really can't send it overseas to most countries without getting a certificate. And so I would have to get in touch. So the Ohio Department of Agriculture does seed inspections for APHIS. So they subcontract with the USDA APHIS, and they would come and inspect the seed and issue a certificate. And so with that certificate, I can send seed overseas. Now, of course, I work for a university. I have no budget, and it costs money to get this inspection done. And so what I tell people is that I will send seed within the United States, but I cannot send it overseas because I don't have the resources to pay for the inspection and the certificate. So really the short answer for that is in most cases, no, you can't. Now I don't know who's listening, so I may be making a mistake by saying this, but it's kind of like ripping off the label on the mattress. But there's a good reason that you shouldn't be doing it. And that good reason is to prevent the spread of seed-borne pathogens.
Which ties in nicely to the next question. And, as a tomato expert, there are a lot of seed-borne diseases. A few folks were wondering where they can find out about seed-borne diseases and how much of an issue that is in seed sharing.
So I would consider it to be a potentially big issue in crops. So when we save seed from literally thousands of tomato accessions every year. We have a very detailed protocol that involves acid treatment, trisodium phosphate treatment, and then dry heat treatment. And we also do tests for specific pathogens that would be really difficult for a hobbyist to do. Okay. And where Denise and I live in Ohio, it's a great environment for seed-borne pathogens. So I would say it would be a bad idea for a hobbyist to save tomato seed in Ohio using a fermentation protocol and then send that to somebody else. It's a lot easier to find information on seed-borne pathogens of crops than it is of natives. We do have some issues with seed-borne diseases of natives. There's a black walnut disease that's kind of creeping north that can be seed-borne. I guess all I can say is we should educate ourselves. And your state extension is a good place to start. Find out who in extension is the plant pathology expert and ask them questions and see what they can come up with. The difficulty of putting on a presentation that goes into details on seed saving techniques is that it's so different species to species. And so all I can really urge is that you educate yourselves. Okay.
So now let me ask you some specific species questions. Haha. So there are several questions on cross-pollination and, totally your call, which ones are easy to make generalizations about or not. So Sally asks about distances. What distances are safe to prevent cross-pollination? I'm sure it depends on the crop, but that's the way the question was posted.
Yeah, so that's the perfect "it depends" answer, because it doesn't just depend on the crop, it also depends on the pollinator. Okay. And so if you're concerned, make some cages.
And right? That's actually the next question, which is, can you talk about those rectangular isolation cages, where you buy them? Do you make your own, or how folks can access those to use them?
Yeah, so the answer is yes to both. So we have made our own. And I'm fortunate to live in a place where there are some very talented Amish seamstresses. And so if I provide them the mesh and bag dimensions, I can get bags made. Tents can be made with, PVP tubing. Probably need to stake them down with a tent stake or something else so they don't blow away in the wind. And there are also commercial sources for all of these. Right. So again, most hobbyists I know really like to make these things themselves. Right. It's part of the fun. It's the winter activity. Right. Move the couch out of the living room and start putting together cages. But they can be purchased as well. And you'll want to, again, this is to educate yourself. What are the pollinators you're trying to either exclude or keep inside? Right. And when it comes to pollinators, you can also purchase them. Onion breeders purchase flies and cage them up and let the flies do all their work for them. Right.
I will ask you a specific tomato question. Craig is wondering how long the seeds may stay viable. 15 years or more if they're stored properly, or maybe in general about other seed storage and longevity?
Yeah, I'm a little humbled that Craig is asking me a question. Given his standing in the community. But yes, 15 to 20 years if they are stored cool and at low humidity. And I'm going to stress low humidity is the most important in that. So yeah, I mean, I have seed that's over 20 years old that I can get to germinate. So, and then, I mean, Craig, when I was presenting this to, people that were interested in vegetable seed, we had a whole section on seed storage. And, at a university, we have very sophisticated seed storage rooms, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and very low humidity. And they're old enough that they routinely break down. And so I've sort of gravitated towards a room that I can keep at below 70 degrees, and I bag seed with desiccant, and I swap out the desiccant on occasion. So, dry is really important.
Okay, let's end with just your opinion on seed catalogs at libraries. Do you have do you think of them in a friendly way, in a problematic way, or in a neutral way?
So I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of encouraging people to grow things. And if seed can be present in a library and kind of foster that, love of gardening, it's great. But I also feel that most libraries are not really funded well enough to do it right. And so it's kind of up to volunteers to think about what they're really offering and why. If you think about the original idea of these seed exchange libraries, you would take something out, you would grow it, you would save seed, and you would make a deposit back, right? That was the original concept. I think that's problematic in that if one is going to use that model, one also needs to have very detailed protocols and maybe even a way of making sure that people have followed those protocols. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with garbage eventually. There's that law of physics that things tend towards chaos. And that would go with seed sharing and saving as well.
Well, David, thank you so much. We had lots of questions, folks, that we couldn't get to, but thanks for your attention and for all your good input. I will save the chat transcript and I'll post it on the B-Lab website. I'll send you in the email the link to that. So not everyone could access all those links, but we'll be sure that those are shared with you. I know that David will appreciate a thank you in the chat box if you haven't already done so. So thanks everybody for coming. David, again, thanks for sharing your expertise. Looking forward to the beautiful sunny skies coming to Ohio. And thanks, everybody.
All right. Happy gardening, everybody.